Good evening and welcome back to Evelina. Evelina has so far not been having a great time with the Brangtons and Madame Duval in London. But you know what? It's nothing to what's going to come. I mean, just imagine the last person Evelina is going to want to meet while she's out with the Brangtons. Letter the 52nd. Evelina in continuation. Holborn, 1st July, 5 o'clock in the morning. Oh, sir, what an adventure have I to write! All night it has occupied my thoughts, and I am now risen thus early to write it to you. Yesterday it was settled that we should spend the evening in Marylebone Gardens, where Monsieur Torre, a celebrated foreigner, was to exhibit some fireworks. The party consisted of Madame Duval, all the Brangtons, Monsieur Dubois, Mr. Smith, and Mr. Brown. We were almost the first persons who entered the gardens, Mr. Brangton having declared he would have all he could get for his money, which at best was only fooled away at such silly and idle places. We walked in parties, and were very much detached from one another. Mr. Brown and Miss Polly led the way by themselves. Miss Brangton and Mr. Smith followed, and the latter seemed determined to be revenged for my behaviour at the ball by transferring all his former attention for me to Miss Brangton, who received it with an air of exultation, and very frequently they each of them, though from different motives, looked back, to discover whether I observed their good intelligence. Madame Duval walked with Monsieur Dubois, and Mr. Brangton by himself, but his son would willingly have attached himself wholly to me, saying frequently, "Come, miss, so you and I have a little fun together. You see how they have all left us, so now let us leave them." But I begged leave to be excused, and went to the other side of Madame Duval. This garden, as it is called, is neither striking for magnificence nor for beauty, and we were all so dull and languid that I was extremely glad when we were summoned to the orchestra upon the opening of a concert, in the course of which I had the pleasure of hearing a concerto on the violin by Mr. Bartholomon, who to me seems a play of exquisite fancy, feeling, and variety. When notice was given us that the fireworks were preparing, we hurried along to secure good places for the sight, but very soon we were so encircled and incommoded by the crowd that Mr. Smith proposed the ladies should make interest for a form to stand upon. This was soon effected, and the men then left us to accommodate themselves better, saying they would return the moment the exhibition was over. The firework was really beautiful, and told with wonderful ingenuity the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, but at the moment of the fatal look which separated them for ever, there was such an explosion of fire and so horrible a noise that we all, as of one accord, jumped hastily from the form and ran away some paces, fearing that we were in danger of mischief from the innumerable sparks of fire which glittered in the air. For a moment or two I neither knew nor considered whither I had run, but my recollection was soon awakened by a stranger addressing me with, "Come along with me, my dear, and I'll take care of you." I started, and then, to my great terror, perceived that I had outrun all my companions, and saw not one human being I knew. With all the speed in my power, and forgetful of my first fright, I hastened back to the place I had left, but found the form occupied by a new set of people. In vain, from side to side, I looked for some face I knew. I found myself in the midst of a crowd, yet without party, friend, or acquaintance. I walked in disordered haste from place to place, without knowing which way to turn, or whither I went. Every other moment I was spoken to by some bold and unfeeling man, to whom my distress, which I think must be very apparent, only furnished a pretence for impertinent witticisms or free gallantry. At last a young officer, marching fiercely up to me, said, "You are a sweet pretty creature, and I enlist you in my service." And then, with great violence, he seized my hand. I screamed aloud with fear, and forcibly snatching it away, I hastily ran up to two ladies, and cried, "For heaven's sake, dear ladies, afford me some protection." They heard me with a loud laugh, but very readily said, "Aye, let her walk between us," and each of them took hold of an arm. Then, in a drawling, ironical tone of voice, they asked, "What had frightened my little ladyship?" I told them my adventure very simply, and entreated they would have the goodness to assist me in finding my friends. "Oh yes, to be sure," they said, "I should not want for friends whilst I was with them." "Mine," I said, "would be very grateful for any civilities which they might favour me." But imagine, my dear sir, how I must be confounded when I observed that every other word I spoke produced a loud laugh. However, I will not dwell upon a conversation which soon, to my inexpressible horror, convinced me I had sought protection from insult of those who were themselves most likely to offer it. You, my dearest sir, I well know, will both feel for and pity my terror, which I have no words to describe. Had I been at liberty, I should have instantly run away from them when I made the shocking discovery. But as they held me fast, that was utterly impossible, and such was my dread of their resentment or abuse that I did not dare make any attempt to escape. They asked me 1,000 questions, accompanied by as many halloos of who I was, what I was, and whence I came. My answers were very incoherent, but what, good heavens, were my emotions, when a few moments after I perceived advancing our way Lord Orville! Never shall I forget what I felt at that instant. Had I indeed been sunk to the guilty state which such companions might lead him to suspect, I could scarce have had feelings more cruelly depressing. However, to my infinite joy, he passed us without distinguishing me, though I saw that in a careless manner his eyes surveyed the party. As soon as he was gone, one of these unhappy women said, "Do you know that young fellow?" Not thinking it possible she should mean Lord Orville by such a term, I readily answered, "No, madam." "Why then," answered she, "you have a monstrous good stare for a little country miss." I now found I had mistaken her, but was glad to avoid any explanation. A few minutes after, what was my delight to hear the voice of Mr. Brown, who called out, "Lord, isn't that Miss What's-her-name?" "Thank God!" cried I, suddenly springing from them both. "Thank God, I have found my party." Mr. Brown was, however, alone, and without knowing what I did, I took hold of his arm. "Lord, miss," cried he, "we've had such a hunt you can't think. Some of them thought you was gone home, but I says I don't think, says I, that she's like to have gone home all alone, says I." "So that gentleman belongs to you, Miss Dizzy?" said one of the women. "Yes, madam," answered I, "and I now thank you for your civility, but as I am safe, I will not give you any further trouble." I curtsied slightly, and would have walked away, but most unfortunately Madame Duval and the two Miss Branghtons just then joined us. They all began to make 1,000 inquiries, to which I briefly answered that I had been obliged to these two ladies for walking with me, and would tell them more another time, for though I felt great comparative courage, I was yet too much intimidated by their presence to dare to be more explicit. Nevertheless, I ventured once more to wish them good night, and proposed seeking Mr. Brangton. These unhappy women listened to all that was said with a kind of callous curiosity, and seemed determined not to take any hint. But my vexation was terribly augmented when, after having whispered something to each other, they very cavalierly declared that they intended joining our party. And then one of them very boldly took hold of my arm, while the other, going round, seized that of Mr. Brown, and thus almost forcibly we were moved on between them and followed by Madame Duval and the Miss Branghtons. It would be very difficult to say which was greatest, my fright or Mr. Brown's consternation, who ventured not to make the least resistance, though his uneasiness made him tremble almost as much as myself. I would instantly have withdrawn my arm, but it was held so tight I could not move it, and poor Mr. Brown was circumstanced in the same manner on the other side, for I heard him say, "Lord, ma'am, there's no need to squeeze one's arm so." And this was our situation, for we had not taken 3 steps when, oh sir, we again met Lord Orville, but not again did he pass quietly by us. And happily I caught his eye. Both mine immediately were bent to the ground, but he approached me, and we all stopped. I then looked up. He bowed. Good God, with what expressive eyes did he regard me! Never were surprise and concern so strongly marked. Yes, my dear sir, he looked greatly concerned, and the remembrance of that is the only consolation I feel for an evening the most painful of my life. What he first said I know not, for indeed I seem to have neither ears nor understanding, but I recollect that I only curtsied in silence. He paused for an instant, as if, I believe so, as if unwilling to pass on, and then, finding the whole party detained, he again bowed and took leave. Indeed, my dear sir, I thought I should have fainted, so great was my emotion from shame, vexation, and 1,000 other feelings for which I have no expressions. I absolutely tore myself from the woman's arm, and then, disengaging myself from that of Mr. Brown, I went to Madame Duval, and besought that she would not suffer me to be again parted from her. I fancy that Lord Orville saw what passed, for scarcely was I at liberty ere he returned. Methought, my dear sir, the pleasure, the surprise of that moment recompensed me for all the chagrin I had before felt. For do you not think that this return manifests from a character so quiet, so reserved as Lord Orville's, something like solicitude in my concerns? Such at least was the interpretation I involuntarily made upon seeing him again. With a politeness to which I have been some time very little used, he apologized for returning, and then inquired after the health of Mrs. Mervyn and the rest of the Howard Grove family. The flattering conjecture which I have just acknowledged has so wonderfully restored my spirits, that I believe I never answered him so readily, and with so little constraint. Very short, however, was the duration of this conversation, for it was soon most disagreeably interrupted. The Miss Branghtons, though they saw almost immediately the characters of the women to whom I had so unfortunately applied, were nevertheless so weak and foolish as merely to titter at their behaviour. As to Madame Duval, she was for some time so strangely imposed upon that she thought they were two fine ladies. Indeed, it is wonderful to see how easily and how frequently she is deceived. Our disturbance, however, arose from young Brown, who was now between the two women, by whom his arms were absolutely pinioned to his sides. For a few minutes his complaints had been only murmured, but he now called out aloud, "Goodness, ladies, you hurt me like anything. Why, I can't walk at all if you keep pinching my arms so." This speech raised a loud laugh in the women, and redoubled the tittering of the Miss Branghtons. For my own part, I was most cruelly confused, while the countenance of Lord Orville manifested a sort of indignant astonishment, and from that moment he spoke to me no more till he took leave. Madame Duval, who now began to suspect her company, proposed our taking the first box we saw empty, bespeaking a supper, and waiting till Mr. Brangton should find us. Miss Polly mentioned one she had remarked, to which we all turned. Madame Duval instantly seated herself, and the two bold women, forcing the frightened Mr. Brown to go between them, followed her example. Lord Orville, with an air of gravity that wounded my very soul, then wished me good night. I said not a word, but my face, if it had any connection with my heart, must have looked melancholy indeed, and so I have some reason to believe it did, for he added with much more softness, though not less dignity, "Will Miss Anville allow me to ask her address, and to pay my respects to her before I leave town?" Oh, how I changed colour at this unexpected request! Yet what was the mortification I suffered in answering, "My lord, I am in Holborn." He then bowed and left us. What can he think of this adventure? How strangely, how cruelly, have all appearances turned against me! Had I been blessed with any presence of mind, I should instantly have explained to him the accident which occasioned my being in such terrible company, but I have none. As to the rest of the evening, I cannot relate the particulars of what passed, for to you I only write of what I think, and I can think of nothing but this unfortunate, this disgraceful meeting. These two wretched women continued to torment us all, but especially poor Mr. Brown, who seemed to afford them uncommon diversion, till we were discovered by Mr. Brangton, who very soon found means to release us from their persecutions by frightening them away. We stayed but a short time after they left us, which was all employed in explanation. Whatever may be the construction which Lord Orville may put upon this affair, to me it cannot fail of being unfavourable. To be seen, gracious heaven, to be seen in company with two women of such character! How vainly, how proudly have I wished to avoid meeting him when only with the Brangtons of Madame Duval! But now how joyful should I be had he seen me to no greater disadvantage! Holborn, too, what a direction! He who had always... But I will not torment you, my dearest sir, with any more of my mortifying conjectures and apprehensions. Perhaps he may call, and then I shall have an opportunity of explaining to him all the most shocking part of the adventure. And yet, as I did not tell him at whose house I lived, he may not be able to discover me. I merely said in Holborn, and he, who I suppose saw my embarrassment, forbore to ask any other direction. Well, I must take my chance. Yet let me, in justice to Lord Orville, and in justice to the high opinion I have always entertained of his honour and delicacy, let me observe the difference of his behaviour when nearly in the same situation to that of Sir Clement Willoughby. He had at least equal cause to depreciate me in his opinion, and to mortify and sink me in my own, but far different was his conduct. Perplexed indeed he looked, and much surprised, but it was benevolently, not with insolence. I am even inclined to think that he could not see a young creature whom he had so lately known in a higher sphere appear so suddenly, so strangely, so disgracefully altered in her situation, without some pity and concern. But whatever might be his doubts and suspicions, far from suffering them to influence his behaviour, he spoke, he looked, with the same politeness and attention with which he had always honoured me when countenanced by Mrs. Mervyn. Once again let me drop this subject. In every mortification, every disturbance, how grateful to my heart, how sweet to my recollection, is the certainty of your never-failing tenderness, sympathy, and protection. Oh, sir, could I, upon this subject, could I write as I feel, how animated would be the language of your devoted Evelina. One can only imagine the glee with which Fanny Burney put pen to paper when she thought up how to manage Evelina's reunion with Lord Orville, and the decisions she made to put Evelina in such a situation. She must have enjoyed it considerably, I think. Letter the 53rd. Evelina in continuation. Holborn, 1st July. Listless, uneasy, and without either spirit or courage to employ myself from the time I had finished my last letter, I indolently seated myself at the window, where, while I rived Madame Duval's summons to breakfast, I perceived among the carriages which passed by a coronet coach, and in a few minutes from the window of it, Lord Orville. I instantly retreated, but not, I believe, unseen, for the coach immediately drove up to our door. Indeed, my dear sir, I must own I was greatly agitated. The idea of receiving Lord Orville by myself, the knowledge that his visit was entirely to me, the wish of explaining the unfortunate adventure of yesterday, and the mortification in my present circumstances, all these thoughts, occurring to me nearly at the same time, occasion me more anxiety, confusion, and perplexity than I can possibly express. I believe he meant to send up his name, but the maid, unused to such ceremony, forgot it by the way, and only told me that a great lord was below and desired to see me, and the next moment he appeared himself. If formerly, when in the circle of high life and accustomed to its manners, I so much admired and distinguished the grace, the elegance of Lord Orville, think, sir, how they must strike me now, when far removed from that splendid circle, I live with those to whom even civility is unknown and decorum a stranger. I am sure I received him very awkwardly, depressed by a situation so disagreeable. Could I do otherwise? When his first inquiries were made, "I think myself very fortunate," he said, "in meeting with Miss Anville at home, and still more so in finding her disengaged." I only curtsied. He then talked of Mrs. Mervyn, asked how long I had been in town, and other such general questions, which happily gave me time to recover from my embarrassment. After which he said, "If Miss Anville will allow me the honour of sitting by her a few minutes, for we were both standing, I will venture to tell her the motive which, next to inquiring after her health, has prompted me to wait on her thus early." We were then both seated, and after a short pause he said, "How to apologize for so great a liberty as I am upon the point of taking, I know not. Shall I therefore rely wholly upon your goodness, and not apologize at all?" I only bowed. I should be extremely sorry to appear impertinent, yet hardly know how to avoid it. "Impertinent! Oh, my lord," cried I eagerly, "that, I am sure, is impossible." "You are very good," answered he, "and encourage me to be ingenuous." Again he stopped, but my expectation was too great for speech. At last, without looking at me, in a low voice and hesitating manner, he said, "Were those ladies with whom I saw you last night ever in your company before?" "No, my lord," cried I, rising and colouring violently, "nor will they ever be again." He rose too, and with an air of the most condescending concern, said, "Pardon, madam, the abruptness of a question which I know not how to introduce as I ought, and for which I have no excuse to offer, but my respect for Mrs. Mervyn, joined to the sincerest wishes for your happiness. Yet I fear I have gone too far." "I am very sensible of the honour of your lordship's attention," said I, "but—" "Permit me to assure you," cried he, finding I hesitated, "that officiousness is not my characteristic, and that I would by no means have risked your displeasure, had I not been fully satisfied you were too generous to be offended, without a real cause of offence. Offended? Cried I. No, my lord, I am only grieved indeed, to find myself in a situation so unfortunate, as to be obliged to make explanations which cannot but mortify and shock me. It is I alone, cried he with some eagerness, who am shocked, as it is I who deserve to be mortified. I seek no explanation, for I have no doubt, but in mistaking me, Miss Anville injures herself. Allow me, therefore, frankly and openly, to tell you the intention of my visit. I bowed, and we both returned to our seats. I will own myself to have been greatly surprised, continued he, when I met you yesterday evening, in company with two persons who I was sensible merited not the honour of your notice. Nor was it easy for me to conjecture the cause of your being so situated. Yet, believe me, my incertitude did not for a moment do you injury. I was satisfied that their characters must be unknown to you, and I thought with concern of the shock you would sustain when you discovered their unworthiness. I should not, however, upon so short an acquaintance, have usurped the privilege of intimacy in giving my unasked sentiments upon so delicate a subject, had I not known that credulity is the sister of innocence, and therefore feared that you might be deceived. Something which I could not resist urged me to the freedom I have taken to caution you, but I shall not easily forgive myself if I have been so unfortunate as to give you pain. The pride which his first question had excited now subsided into delight and gratitude, and I instantly related to him as well as I could the accident which had occasioned my joining the unhappy women with whom he had met me. He listened with an attention so flattering, seemed so much interested during the recital, and when I had done thanked me in terms so polite for what he was pleased to call my condescension, that I was almost ashamed either to look at or hear him. Soon after, the maid came to tell me that Madame Duval desired to have breakfast made in her own room. I fear, cried Lord Orville, instantly rising, that I have intruded upon your time, yet who so situated could do otherwise? Then taking my hand, will Miss Anville allow me thus to seal my peace? He pressed it to his lips and took leave. Generous, noble Lord Orville! How disinterested his conduct! How delicate his whole behaviour! Willing to advise, yet afraid to wound me! Can I ever in future regret the adventure I met with at Marybone, since it has been productive of a visit so flattering? Had my mortification been still more humiliating, my terrors still more alarming, such a mark of esteem, may I not call it so, from Lord Orville would have made me ample amends. And indeed, my dear sir, I require some consolation in my present very disagreeable situation, for since he went, 2 incidents have happened that, had not my spirits been particularly elated, would greatly have disconcerted me. During breakfast, Madame Duval very abruptly asked if I should like to be married, and added that Mr. Brangton had been proposing a match for me with his son. Surprised, and I must own provoked, I assured her that in thinking of me, Mr. Brangton would very vainly lose his time. Why, cried she, I have had kind of use for you myself, if once I could get you to Paris, and make you be owned. But if I can't do that, and you can do no better, why, as you are both my relations, I think to leave my fortune between you, and then, if you marry, you need never want for nothing. I begged her not to pursue the subject, as I assured her Mr. Brangton was totally disagreeable to me, but she continued her admonitions and reflections with her usual disregard of whatever I could answer. She charged me very peremptorily neither wholly to discourage nor yet to accept Mr. Brangton's offer, till she saw what could be done for me. The young man, she added, had often intended to speak to me himself, but not well knowing how to introduce the subject, he had desired her to pave the way for him. I scrupled not, warmly and freely, to declare my aversion to this proposal, but it was to no effect. She concluded, just as she had begun, by saying that if I should not have him, if I could do better. Nothing, however, shall persuade me to listen to any other person concerning this odious affair. My second cause of uneasiness arises very unexpectedly from Monsieur Dubois, who, to my infinite surprise, upon Madame Duval's quitting the room after dinner, put into my hand a note and immediately left the house. This note contains an open declaration of an attachment to me, which he says he should never have presumed to have acknowledged, had he not been informed that Madame Duval destined my hand to young Brangton, a match which he cannot endure to think of. He beseeches me earnestly to pardon his temerity, professes the most inviolable respect, and commits his fate to time, patience, and pity. This conduct in Monsieur Dubois gives me real concern, as I was disposed to think very well of him. It will not, however, be difficult to discourage him, and therefore I shall not acquaint Madame Duval of his letter, as I have reason to believe it would greatly displease her. And we shall stop there. Things are really heating up, are they not, my dear readers? And I shall leave you at this point of peak romance and peak difficulty. Good evening.